When Barack Obama ran for president in 2008, he made headlines by announcing the U.S. would meet face-to-face with Raul Castro at a time and place of his choosing. Our next guest was the director of Hispanic media at the very beginning of the Obama administration. He's now managing director at MDC Strategies here in Washington, D.C. He's been very involved in the push to normalize U.S.-Cuba relations. Luis Miranda, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
You're part of the White House during President Barack Obama's first term. You're in charge of Latin American relations. Take us through what was happening behind the scenes then and why it took so long to see such an historic announcement made.
These things take time, in this case, more than 50 years, right? But the reality is that there was an acknowledgement on the president's part that was echoed in the debates during the presidential campaign and from the very beginning, that he recognized that if you're going to really make progress on tough issues, you've got to confront them head on. And if you're going to try to make peace with enemies, you can't do it if you don't talk to them. And so you saw that going back to a debate in 2007 in South Carolina. And then you certainly saw it at the beginning of the administration. One of the first things we did do in 2009 in April was to loosen the traveling restrictions on Cuban Americans so that they could better visit and support their families. And that on its own has had a bigger effect over the last 5 years than what we had seen the previous 50. And that's what laid the groundwork to be able to now take this significant step, is that you see that a different approach, a flow of contact, and real support make a bigger difference than what we were trying to do before.
But it took 18 months of secret negotiations to get to these two countries coming to an agreement. How many people typically are involved in these type of negotiations? And how did it happen without being leaked to the press? I mean, it came on very suddenly. Nobody had any idea.
But we've got two separate tracks that are important to acknowledge here, which is obviously the very specific negotiations over Alan Gross and what the Cubans were looking for, which was a prisoner swap. Alan is not a spy, so that's why in the end there was no direct trade for Alan Gross. He was released on humanitarian grounds, and the trade that did happen, the swap, was for a intelligence asset the United States had in Havana, who had been in prison for more than 20 years. But that's separate from everything else that we had been working on, which was laying the groundwork for real change in support of the Cuban people. And so there's timelines that at some point converge, but at the same time, there's work that has been going on for a long time to figure out how do we tweak these regulations in a way that make it possible that, you know, right now in Cuba, there's very limited 5% internet penetration rate. Well, you can't really modernize a society. They can't really engage with the 21st century and have a participatory democracy if they don't have access to communications tools. So one of the first things that was obvious is if anybody's going to restrict them from having the tools they need to communicate with one another in the outside world, it shouldn't be the United States. It should be that we're actually helping facilitate that. And so that's the type of thinking that helped shape these policy changes that in essence are designed not to, you know, deal with the Cuban regime, but rather to empower the Cuban people themselves.
Speaking of communication, there were reports that the two presidents spoke on the phone for at least 45 minutes before they made this joint announcement. The first time in 50 years, the presidents of Cuba and the United States had a telephone conversation, that according to White House officials. Do you foresee an Obama-Castro meeting, summit, anytime down the road? Could there be something on the sidelines at the Summit of the Americas, perhaps?
Well, the president made it clear that he's going to the summit, and this is consistent with what I'm saying now, which is that if he doesn't go to the summit to defend our values, who will? You know, America's never shied down from defending our values and our belief in the principles of democracy. The summit is an ideal place because all of the member countries have signed the Inter-American Democratic Charter. And so it's important that he's going, and certainly if both leaders are there, there's a chance that they'll have to interact in some way at that summit, but I'm not going to prejudge that and don't have any announcements from my side. But certainly it sets the stage for much more constructive dialogue. And again, it's less about the United States and Cuba now, and it's about the rest of the region really helping foster a constructive dialogue about all of the peoples of the Americas, but with regard to the Cuban people, really focusing in on their real issues instead of U.S. policies.
What has been the reaction in Florida? Huge Cuban-American population there. You are also from Florida. But Florida's always had an interesting political landscape. Anything can influence the local elections. This has already been talked about for 2016. What impact will this decision have on local national politics?
I don't think that it'll have an effect on the presidential level, because the reality is that those that favored the status quo and wanted to maintain more of a hardline position on Cuba are people who are pretty much set and likely to support a Republican candidate no matter what. So the reality is that it doesn't really significantly shift anything. And we've seen a change in the Cuban American community over the last 30 years. Pew has tracked this. Other things like the Florida International University poll have tracked this, where Cuban Americans first largely disagree and no longer are monolithic. You know, many of them believe that there is an alternative approach, but 72%, more than 70%, agree that the embargo hasn't worked. And so they are open to looking at how do we do alternatives. And I think that's why the key of what the president did was to say, we're going to re-engage here, but it's not to absolve, it's to really have a better platform on which to elevate the issues of human rights and of constructively moving forward.
All right, Luis Miranda, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you so much.
America's Now